Right. This is something quirky. This is an Englishman's reaction to a bit of something about Polish art, Polish literature, which came on a very strange route. This is a tribute to Krzysztof Kamil Baczynski. Not wrong picture. That's back to Biskupin. Ella, what's happened?
Don't worry,
No?
just wait.
That's right.
Just wait.
Okay, what's the problem? I'm sharing the slideshow. What's the problem?
He has his habit of pressing the mouse.
Sorry.
So he saw Biskupin because when it froze earlier, when I tried to use it, it froze. But now we touched it.
Okay, I'll go back to that. Anyway,
we are on Krzysztof Kamil Baczynski.
Okay, 1921 to 1944. He died when he was 23, and he died in the Warsaw uprising. And he died, I think, on the 4th or 5th day of the actual fighting. He was shot by a sniper. And he was a young poet and painter as well. He did some really good paintings. But he wrote some wonderful poems. I found out about him on a visit to Bentley Priory in where are we?
Stanmore.
Stanmore.
Yeah, during the break from lockdowns.
Yeah, which is the Royal Air Force, was the Royal Air Force headquarters, which we'll talk about more in the next program, next film. But there we met.
I started chatting.
You started chatting, as you do, with a very interesting guy from America, all right, called John Dietmann, who is not able to be with us. Otherwise, he would have talked about Baczynski, because he obviously knew a lot about the Polish airmen and about Poland. He is a lover of Poland, and he came across Baczynski, and he was so impressed by him and his life that he actually wrote a poem, which is the next slide.
Yes, and he sent me the poem.
Right. Yeah.
And allowed me to share it with the public.
So it starts with some words are more than poetry, in memoriam KKB. And this is from something that he wrote. How good you did not live to see the day when they will raise a monument to heroes like you, and your murderers will place flowers on your tomb. And then John wrote this poem. They did come back to the tomb they created for you, just as you predicted they would. They in their black vulture suits and under the red star of blood shed at their commands, proclaimed the corpses they'd produced as their own victories, or wept in celebration of their absolution. Now the vultures' nests are desolate and empty of progeny. The red star lies in a dung heap. The eagle with two heads looks eastward and westward, hovering it sees below the blessed homeland restored. Sleep, sleep, poet of the ashes, your verses are your monument, which built itself beforehand.
Yeah.
And John wrote to Joanna, and the next slide, please. He wrote this poem has never been published, John's poem, because it was a personal expression of what I felt after reading Norman Davis's book, Rising 44. Over the years, I'd given copies to Polish young people who had asked if they knew who KKB was. If they said yes, they received a copy. Davis is a British scholar who is an expert on Polish history and speaks and writes in Polish. He's a professor at Krakow University. Share the poem, he said to Joanna, with anyone who answers the question correctly. Well, no one was asked, but you've got it. And if you wish, translate it into the language KKB loved and died to defend. And here's the next slide. There's some couple of references I found to him. This is John Dietmann.
He shared the picture with me. He showed us the picture at the museum, and then he sent it to us.
Okay, and there he's standing attention at Remembrance Day in November 2020. And I think this is where the cultures kind of come together over a very, very sad, tragic situation. And it's a different timing, but it's still the same feeling that the young poet Baczynski, to me, reminds me of the First World War poets. And it is in this country, because the amount of young lives lost in the First World War here are very similar to, tragically, to the young lives that were lost in the Second World War in Poland. And the poetry that came out of both those occasions was the poetry of young men killed too early, many of them. Next slide, please. And this is in Folkestone, a road of remembrance, all the poppies there, a remembrance to all those young men who actually left from Folkestone to go to France, Belgium, to fight, and sadly to die, many of them. Next slide, please.
So they made this knitted poppies to remember.
This is one of Baczynski's drawings, and it's for the poem Generation. He's writing about his own generation of young men, young women as well, who died in the uprising, who died defending their country. Can we have the poem, please?
The next slide.
Next slide. Excuse me reading them, but I think it's obviously it was written in Polish and it's a translation, but it's a good translation. It gives you an idea. Obviously, if you want to check the Polish, please do. We learned our lesson. There is no mercy. By night come dreams of the brother who died, his eyes put out while he was still living, beaten until his bones were all broken, deep and painful the chisel's carving, his eyes bulging like bubbles with blood. We learnt our lesson. There is no conscience. Buried by fear, we live in pits. In terror, we carve out our dark loves, statues of ourselves, evil troglodytes. We learnt our lesson. There is no love. How could we then escape into darkness from the sail of the nostrils sniffing us out, from the staves and hands in their spreading net, when the mothers and children would never come back to the hollowed out pod of an empty heart? He says there is no love, and yet there was a very brief, passionate love between him and his wife, Barbara. Next poem, please. Next slide. That's not her, but it's a drawing. It's obviously a painting he did. This is part of a poem, part of a love poem, originally called Erotique, to her. And they were young, they were small. One of his friends describes them at their wedding, that they married only a few months before they were both killed. Yeah. He was killed a few weeks before her, and she didn't know he'd been shot.
She was killed on the 1st of September, I think, and he 3rd or 4th of August. 44.
So this is a love poem, something different, but it shows the kind of imagery and power of his writing.
And again, it's a translation, so I mean, we looked at several, and Tony chose this one.
Yeah. Okay. Flowing into you still and bearing your reflection in pupils, or like a tear from eyelids hanging, I'll hear in you silver seas etched by a dolphin, like sleep inside the shell of your body ringing. Or in a grove where you are a birch tree, pure white air and the milk of daylight, a huge barbarian bearing 1,000 centuries, I'll burst with the copse's noise into your branches, bird-like. So it's a taste of some of his poetry. Next slide, please. Now this is something rather different. We've been talking about culture, about generations, about different generations. This is something about the modern generation, who Oscar represents, sort of going to and fro between Poland and this country, living a kind of a life with internet and everything, and how their experience of the two cultures are very different, because it's not just the two cultures, it's other cultures mixing here. And this was a quote from an article that Joanna gave me, written by a young lady from Wood University 3 or 4 years ago. And she quotes this: in July 2012, for Madame Mephisto, A.M. Bacala, a female author who had moved from Wrocław to London, was longlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. In one of her articles, the writer stresses that it is a sign of our times that migration between countries offers to many people the best of both worlds. And then further on she says this: in a relatively short period of time, social, political and economic relationships between countries have intensified globally. The internet has brought into being a virtual reality parallel to the real world. Nation-state borders have grown blurred and porous. Migrations on a large scale have become part of everyday life. But the new migrants, in contrast to previous generations of newcomers, maintain stronger familial, economic, political and religious ties to home. At the same time, they have been undergoing integration processes in receiving countries faster than before, forging links with host societies and adapting to their values and lifestyles. And I chose that because I was thinking of a young lady I worked with and put her own writing into slightly better English. Hers wasn't too bad, but I made it, I hope, a bit better. And she was writing about the life of an intern, a Polish intern living in London, and the kind of relationships she had with the different people she met here. And she ended up with having a relationship with a Lebanese gentleman. So just the whole mix of life and situations that people can get involved in. My last slide is going back, although it's something that's contemporary. There is something very special about the writing, especially of writers who have lived in a different country, whether they've grown up in it or whether they've moved to that country later on. They cast a particular light and show things that maybe people who live in that country are not so aware of. And I'm going to talk about Joseph Conrad, who really does deserve a mention. Lived at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, spent a lot of he left Poland when he was like 13, 14 and spent 30 odd years as a mariner, mostly in Indonesia. Then he moved here and he spent the last 30 odd years of his life in England. He wrote mostly about life in other parts of the world. Maybe that was his way of being able to say things about this society here that he wouldn't have been able to touch otherwise. Perhaps his most famous book was Heart of Darkness, about the Congo, about Africa, and about the horrible colonial attitude experience there and what it inflicted on the local people. And a book that has effects now. It was used in Apocalypse Now, the film about Vietnam, about a sort of stray colonel who goes crazy in the jungles of Vietnam and assuming power. But Heart of Darkness, there's a film, all right, which this one is about, which is called African Apocalypse, which we saw a few weeks ago. And it's filmed, I don't know if we can get it online yet, but it was filmed by an ex-student of Oxford, a Nigerian guy who had read Heart of Darkness and wanted to go and see the effect of that book and what it was describing in the area which it was about. He actually followed the journey of a French colonel, military man, who was going through Niger and was trying with his French troops to carve a bit of Western Africa for the French as opposed to the British. And he basically massacred with his troops, massacred lots of people on the way to securing this route through Niger. The young man then travelled that same route 100 years later, and that's what the subject of this film is, meeting the people and seeing that their experience was still being lived. They were still talking about it. It was something that hadn't left them. And so to go back, it needed someone like Conrad to see the dark heart of the colonial England, the colonial Britain, the empire, which is now coming to light again. So, you know, it's that what people who live in another country, what they add to that country, it is so important. And it's why I'm proud to live in a multicultural land. Anyway, thank you very much.